Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Policing in America podcast. I'm your host, Sergeant Tom. We have some exciting new issues coming up, new releases coming up, and I've been doing some work with City Journal and some work with the Manhattan Institute. Keep a lookout for future episodes. Please come visit us at policinginamerica.com. Look us up on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you get your podcast. And today I have someone from City Journal. His name is Robert Verbruggen. I hope you enjoy the episode. And keep a lookout for more. Thank you. And with me today is a special guest, Robert Verbruggen. He is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where he provides policy research. He also writes for City Journal. He contributes to special projects and initiatives in the president's office. Robert has held roles as a deputy managing editor at National Review, a managing editor at the American Conservative, editor at Real Clear Policy, and an assistant book editor at the Washington Times. Robert also writes on a wide array of issues, including economic policy, public finance, healthcare, education, cancel culture, public safety, and on. Robert was a Phillips Foundation Journalism Fellow. He's also the winner of the Chicago Headline Club Peter Lisagor Award, and he also holds his academic credentials out of Northwestern University. Robert, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Robert, I have to ask, because I'm just meeting you for the first time, are you from Chicago?
No, I grew up in Wisconsin, Green Bay area.
Oh boy.
Yeah, so I went to Northwestern. It was reasonably close.
And I bet you're a Packer fan.
I grew up right by the stadium, actually, but I never caught that bug. My father's a huge Packer fan. We had cheese heads in the house and everything, but somehow I never got into sports. So.
Oh my goodness. Well, yeah, I'm sure you're an honorary Packer fan from your family lineage.
Oh, sure.
It just, by blood at that point. So, Robert, I'm going to jump right into it. And you have a recent brief out of the Manhattan Institute. And the title of it is Depolicing and What to Do About It. So this is a topic that I think is going to resonate with a lot of officers nationwide. I just spent time with a few agencies, and the morale that I see across the country couldn't be lower. And I've heard stories, without citing the agencies, where officers will say, we're like the fire department. Call us if you need us, but otherwise we'll be out of sight, out of mind. And I know it's hard to find causation with this, but we are seeing quite a rise in crime across many different cities. And it's hard to imagine that this depolicing idea isn't at least strongly correlated with that. But I'd love to hear, and I'm sure the listeners would love to hear, some of the incredible work you've been doing on this.
Sure. Well, to start with just sort of this phenomenon of depolicing. I think we've, especially going back to about Ferguson, so going back 6 or 7 years now, we've seen it just repeatedly in city after city where you have these same three things happen all at about the same time. One, you have some sort of viral incident that happens where a police officer is caught on tape. Some of these things are very bad, things that were legitimate abuses, and sometimes they turn out to be things where the video doesn't show the whole story. But you have some sort of viral incident that captures everybody's attention. And that provokes a lot of protest. And then the next thing you see in response to that protest is that cops are sort of demoralized and they step back. And then the other thing you see at about the same time is that crime goes up. And there have been a number of studies documenting that this happens, with pretty astonishing regularity in city after city. To my mind, one of the best and most thorough is a recent paper by Tanaya Debbie and Roland Fryer that showed, I think it was about 5 or 6 different cities. It's these things just go together. They go together, and they drew a number of closer connections, such as that the individual neighborhoods, places within cities that have the biggest depolicing, the biggest policing drops, also see the largest rise in crime. And also, if you look at the broader literature just on policing and crime, there are a lot of policing strategies that work. There's a lot of evidence that when you do more police, when you do specific types of policing, proactive policing in these neighborhoods with high crime, you can bring crime down. So it's really not a surprise that when the police back off, you see the opposite of that. You see crime go up. So that is sort of the core of the issue here. And And I think it's an enormous problem that I think the whole country is dealing with it now, because most of the most compelling evidence is on that city to city level, where you can look and see there was an incident in the city, and there was depolicing in the city, and there was an increase in crime in the city. But I think we're seeing it nationwide to a large extent now, because so many of these videos have nationwide attention. And so many officers are saying in surveys that they're, as you said, demoralized. They're feeling like they can't get out there. So the thing that I wanted to do with this brief, it actually has kind of an interesting origin story, because I wrote a piece for National Review about 6 months or so ago, and it was about one of these studies. It was the one by Travis Campbell. It was a different study showing some similar phenomena. And I mentioned toward the end of the article that cities really have to start figuring out ways to deal with this when it happens. There's enough research now showing that this is real and that it's a problem. And I said cities should start dealing with this when it happens, and they should think about doing things like disciplining the officers who are pulling back. And that got me a lot of pushback. I got some police officers who followed me on Twitter were responding to me. I don't know if you're familiar with the Graham Factor blog, but I got a non-favorable mention on his blog. And my father's actually a retired police officer. He gave me a call and was talking to me about some of this stuff. And that's when I started really thinking like, this is something that I think is a gap in what we know and what we're talking about. Because there are all these discussions. When you have these incidents, you have the use of force experts saying this is justified or it's not justified. You have all these studies saying there's depolicing or there's not depolicing, and is or isn't contributing to crime. But it's hard to find out, what do you do about this when it happens? And that's what I tried to answer in the brief as best I could. And if I'm being honest, it's not entirely satisfactory. I feel like there's enough going on here that you can't fix with public policy, that to some extent, this is just going to keep happening.
So I'm taking notes as we go, and I'm going to see if I can kind of line some things up, and we'll get into the brief because it's an incredible body of work. How much of this do you think is politically driven? And I know that's almost like a low-hanging fruit question, but to the extent that, are we seeing a depolicing even in areas that aren't controlled, say by like super democratic majorities?
Well, I mean, the clearest effects that you can see when you look at the data are in specific cities, and those tend to be big cities, big urban cities, which just sort of by their nature tend to be more democratic. However, you've also seen broad-based crime increases across the country in a lot of ways, and there it gets much more difficult to say that is because of depolicing. So, I mean, certainly, I think you have even nationwide surveys of police say that police are worried about this and that they're pulling back. So I think it's definitely happening in Republican areas as well as Democratic areas. But whether you can make that explicit connection everywhere in the country, as opposed to just the specific cities where you see it most clearly, is a trickier question.
Okay, so then we are seeing it. We're seeing it in a broad spectrum. We're seeing it across the board. So that kind of helps us to kind of shape this a little bit. Now, let me just land on this lily pad with the disciplining cops who pull back. How did you envision this?
Well, back 6 months ago, before I did all the work, I mean, I was thinking. Look, I mean, I've been following policing issues for a long time. I know that nobody likes quotas, but there are many states that have banned quotas, but not even all the states that didn't ban quotas. So what I was thinking of is not necessarily an explicit quota where you'd say you have to make these specific number of stops, but that I was thinking you could, go into the data and see, if there's specific cops who are very clearly, deliberately pulled back, that you could step in and do something about it. And as I discussed in the brief, I do think there are ways to intervene in situations like that. From the interviews I did with police officers and experts, I think there are ways that you can look at that data and talk to those cops and see what's going on. But just from the response I got from people I talked to who really know this and do it for a living, that is not going to fly. Outright discipline for not doing the right.
Yeah, it would be interesting because the incentive then I feel like some of what we're in, it's multivariate, right? There's a lot of variables coming at that is giving this conclusion. And I can't help but think, looking at some of the data, the CompStat idea is a great idea, accountability and laser zones and more effective policing. But when everything is a metric and the metric now becomes the goal. So arrests are just a metric, but it seems like that arrest now becomes the goal. And that ceases now to be a good metric because that's all we're doing. We're just counting the arrests. And then you start having competitions and we start dehumanizing what policing is, and we just look at it as making arrests, tickets, and it just could go down a wrong hole. But I was just kind of curious. I hadn't heard that, and boy, I could imagine the backlash that you receive from that. But what I've tried to do with my young officers is sort of instill this sense of nobility and the idea that policing is a noble profession, not because it's easy and not because it's something everybody can do. There's a police leader, part of on the circuit. His name is Chip Huth, and he's had a TED Talk, and he's out of Kansas City, Missouri. Brilliant guy, scholar, philosopher. And we were having this conversation. He said, Tom, remind your officers that the oath doesn't have an escape clause. So when these men and women swore an oath, they never said, I do solemnly swear to uphold the Constitution, protected enemies, unless, of course, the mayor doesn't support me. Or unless, of course, the citizens really rile up and don't like me. And I thought, wow, that's a very profound statement. Like, you swore an oath, sort of the in sickness and health and better for worse. Do you think that approach has some merit?
Yeah, and that's something that I heard from a lot of people, is that you can't do quotas. You can't basically force the issue. You can't force somebody to get out there. But what you can do is motivate people and work with people. And especially when you have more street level police leaders like sergeants. If you have good people on the ground there motivating your guys and using that kind of rhetoric, saying, this is a time when the city really needs us because there's been this incident and people are not trusting the cops, and we're having crime. This is when they really need us, even though we're facing all this backlash. I think that kind of thing could be effective. It's just a matter of finding the right people to do it, and hopefully, having the mayor on board does not hurt.
No doubt. So we go down to your topic lines here. The pressure, though, to depolice. So it's not always that police are just pulling back. And you cited some interesting articles coming in the press. These officers are scared to police, or they don't want to do their job, or cops don't want to hold other cops accountable. But my goodness, we are hearing from a pretty vocal group of people that we don't want you here. We don't want you doing these things, because policing is going to have disparities in data. And disparities don't always mean discrimination. It could, but it doesn't always. And when you make those leaps and those nexuses, and people say, we don't want you here. So how do we address that part first?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about, are we talking about city leaders who are saying that, or do you mean more from the public?
More from the public.
I mean, that's a hard thing. I mean, that's something that I heard a lot. And one of the things I say in the brief is that a lot of the pressures that police are facing are not something that you can fix with public policy. Cops will tell you, I don't want to be the next YouTube video. We're not going to ban YouTube. We're not going to ban the news media from covering these things. And, as somebody with a background in journalism, I do wish journalists would be better about some of these things and being more careful with things until evidence is in, and, not going whole hog on some of these stories that later turn out to be not even a justified incident. But the bottom line is, a lot of this stuff you can't affect with public policy. You can't, you're not going to change those things. We're caught up in a moment right now culturally, and we can hope the culture can change, and we can try to change the culture, but that's not something that you can implement in a law or by changing the mayor's mind.
Yeah, very, very interesting. You mentioned the media. When I talk to officers, when I say, so where are the problems? What are the root causes? And within the first top three, usually the one or two, the media. And the media doesn't like us. And boy, it depends on where you sit politically, how you look at the media. And, and it seems like it's unfair for so many ways, because the cops do get sort of a raw deal. I try to be impartial. So I consume the Washington Post, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Times. And it really, you could look at one scenario and the way it's worded will completely sort of prime the reader. I recall one time with LA, there was a shooting that happened, and it was a once in a lifetime event. It was a domestic violence that turned into a murder. The suspect got in the car, kidnapped, drove through the city, high-speed pursuit, jumped out, got into a shooting, ran into a Trader Joe's. Officers returned fire, and one of those bullets hit unfortunately a citizen. It was just a crazy incident. And one media outlet said LAPD officers kill citizens in shootout, and the other one said citizen unfortunately dies in gunfire battle between suspect and officers. And obviously, one, they're both correct, but they both paint a very different perspective. Is there anything police can do, or policy? Can there be a policy for media to remain a little more neutral or to work with police?
I mean, that sort of thing is it's up to the media themselves. That's the bottom line. Is we have a First Amendment. It's free. I think I graduated journalism school, which maybe was my first mistake in 2006. But I mean, even since then, I think there's been just sort of this massive split between different types of media, and I think this idea of impartial media has actually been consciously thrown by the wayside by even a lot of, I think, mainstream organs, including to an extent, places like the Washington Post and the New York Times, where they're basically taking the stance that they have a certain subscriber base that isn't representative of the whole country, and they want to sort of serve that base and serve that base's own prejudices and beliefs. So I mean, as long as we have a First Amendment, and as a journalist, I very much treasure the First Amendment. I just don't know how you get the media to do anything that they don't want to do.
Yeah, I don't know. I hate to think that it is just the old adage of if it bleeds, it leads. And, the media doesn't report on the hundreds of thousands of planes that land safely. They report on the one that crashes. And so they're not going to report on the tens of thousands of instances of policing. They're going to report on the bad one. But it would be nice if they had some scale. And they did report on this, but maybe just tweak it a little bit by saying an officer and not just like police in Minnesota. An officer did this, and it would be nice if there was just a little bit more care, because they do incite a response.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's the media was something that officers mentioned to me too. Media, YouTube videos, viral videos. The cops feel under fire when they look at a story or something like that, and they don't get that it was done fairly. And I think that happens. It happens too much.
And so we're going to your section where it says what cops fear. And it's interesting because I will speak to some officers in some of the bigger organizations, and some will say they fear the next viral video, but many will also say they fear the internal pressure more than the external pressure. Did you see some of that in your data collection?
Yeah, I noticed that what you just described so much that I actually started asking people explicitly, which is more important to you. And I actually got both answers. Some people say, I don't blame the protesters. They have their job to do. I'm worried about, not, my own superiors not having my back. And some people would say, it really is just, there's this enormous climate throughout the country here, and that's the problem. So that's it's interesting that you said that, because I noticed the same thing.
Yeah, I do it on a much smaller scale than what you did, but it was enough to where I started to see the trend lines. And sometimes I think we in policing we have a PR problem, that's for sure. And we also I think we have a language problem. And let me explain this. When cops will say certain things like, I wish the chiefs would have our back, it seems like when that gets translated to the citizenry, that has a very colloquial street vernacular, like just watch my back, even if I do something wrong. And maybe if officers articulated just a little better and said, I just wish my command staff would give us the benefit of the doubt, or would pause, if they could be a little more articulate in that and not use that language. Do you think there's any room for that?
Yeah, that was actually something that people said to me too, that they would say, we want people to have our back, and then they kind of catch themselves and say, because that's extremely common. The two phrases that I heard a lot of were, have our back and thrown under the bus.
Yeah.
Right. Those are the two cliches that just about everybody I talked to, whether it was a cop or an expert, you made some use of those two phrases. And sometimes there would be that hesitation around have our back, because it sounds like, to the average person, it kind of sounds like, I want you to support me whatever I do. And that's not what they mean. I'll tell you that. No police officer expects to be able to do whatever he feels like doing and get away with it. What they want is related to these ideas of, sort of due process, or, as I discussed in the brief, your organizational justice and procedural justice are the fancy acronyms. terms for it. They want to feel like if something happens, that there's going to be a fair process to find out what happened, and they're going to be treated fairly. So that if somebody does something wrong, they do get punished. But they
Sure.
want to feel like if something happens, it's not going to be that a out of context video comes out, and the next day you've got the governor putting out a press release, basically accusing you of murder.
Yeah, murder and under the cloud of authority with racism attached and all the other things that make it so much more hyperbolic and catastrophic. The bad event is a bad event. And this is something in some of my collection that I noticed is officers want the difference between a bad action and we're gonna put this out a bad action that's intentional or with malice and a bad action that's truly a mistake. Like critical thinking is hard enough, but when you're under the pressures of, and I'm not trying to make excuses, but I am trying to paint a broader picture of this. When you have stress and you have sleep deprivation, you have lack of knowledge and bad lighting, and you're being primed because you're going to the call and the operator is saying they're armed with a knife, citizen calling saying there's a fight. And so you're getting amped up. And when you get there, you're expecting to see something and you're expecting sort of contention and just friction. And it's very hard when you have that inertia in your brain to just stop all of a sudden. And, you have to assume the worst and bring it down. Did you hear any of that as well?
Not so much, but that's just something I've noticed a lot from following these incidents is that some of them involve what you might call like understandable mistakes.
Okay.
Situations where an officer does something wrong, but you can see how it happened. And I think that's something that the law struggles to deal with. I mean, it means that person then get convicted of murder, manslaughter. What happens? What is the public going to think is fair? What is fair? Right. And it's also something that just feeds into a lot of these incidents where where the officer either misperceived something or used force in a way that might have not been ideal, but ended up having complications where somebody ended up dying. I mean, there's all these cases where some of the most protested cases are not cases where somebody was shot even, but cases where something else happened. You have Freddie Gray, George Floyd, Eric Garner. Mm-hmm. So you have all of these cases where the intentions were not necessarily matched to what happened. And I think that's an interesting area for the law, and I think it's an interesting area for how we see these cases and how we see the police.
I noticed in the article, and this is because it perked my interest. I have taught procedural justice for a long time. I've embraced this idea, and I truly get behind it because there's a little bit of this neuroscience of how important perception is. So it's not just did I do it right? It's not just did I do it constitutional, but does the person understand that I did it right? Does the person understand that I did my best to be neutral? Did I give them a voice? Just because it's this is a hard concept, I think, for a lot of officers. Just because it's constitutional doesn't necessarily mean it's right. It means it's not legal. Like I tell cops, okay, so you engage in this, you won't go to prison. You just won't work here. So and that is a hard thing to accept. Like, well, I didn't break the law, so why am I getting in trouble? Because in policing, it's did you break the law? Did you not break the law? But then you have these policies, ideas. So I'm going to ask you in your research with the PJ, with the procedural justice. First off, did officers embrace this idea, or did it seem too academic, pie in the sky?
Well, that's actually that's not research that I did. I cite that research. It's Justin Nix did a lot of it.
Okay.
So I'm citing research that was done by other people.
Okay, I see.
But my understanding is, I mean, just from having read about it, is that cops tend to understand it. Like, I think it's something that it's important to cops that they be treated that way. And also because there's these two related concepts. There's organizational justice, which is mainly within the police department. And then there's procedural justice, which is then divided into internal procedural justice for the police department. And then procedural justice in terms of the way that police interact with the public, which is a little more outside the scope of what I'm talking about, because I'm talking more the way that cops are expecting to be treated. But that's a lot of needless jargon, I think, to basically talk about fair treatment. Like when something happens, a police officer wants to feel that there are procedures in place and there are rules in place, and what he did is going to be evaluated according to what he was taught and according to what the rules are. Right. I think that is something that I think police officers tend to be very rule based in their thinking, and I think that's something that that resonates with them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I will teach cops, and most of my audiences are the younger cops, younger with time on the job. And The PJ concept, they're like, oh yeah, totally get this. Like they don't fight back. It's just like body worn video. If you have 15, 20 years on the job, the body worn video, you're skeptical. But if you're young, if you're under 10 years, that's all you know. So for them, they're like, yeah, sure, body worn video. Yeah, let's go. I feel good about this. With the PJ, what I notice is the younger officers get it. The older officers, time on being old, say, well, there's no internal procedural justice. And this is the conundrum I try to explain to some of the citizens, because there's this perception that police unions and internal affairs are just, they have the backs of the officers. And, there's a bad incident and it's just going to get swept under the rug. And I always say, ask an officer, do you like internal affairs? And overwhelmingly, they're going to say, no, forget those guys. Okay, so that's just some evidence that if these entities were truly watching out for the cops, well, then they should love internal affairs. But you cited in your work that only 45% of officers thought the discipline process was fair. So you see this contradiction on what the public thinks and what the police think.
Exactly. I mean, and I think, and I didn't go too deeply into disciplinary processes precisely because I was so strongly warned off of discipline being any part of the solution.
Yes.
But yeah, it seems like there's this sort of conflicting, even among some police, I think, have this conflicting sense of, like, on the one hand, a bad cop isn't necessarily held to account by the disciplinary processes because there are just appeal options. I mean, and this is something that varies across departments, so it's hard to generalize because you have 18,000 police departments. But there are a lot of appeals options. There are all sorts of different ways to drag these things out in a case where the officer did something wrong. And then there's also this perception though that when cops don't do anything wrong and it's a frivolous complaint, a lot of times they end up dealing with all this hassle. Mm-hmm. I think it was Peter Moskos. I think you've had him on your program as well. I talked to him, and I think he referred to it as a jackpot. I think he wrote about it in his book as well.
That's right.
The concept of being in the jackpot, that isn't even a judgment on whether anything you did was wrong or not. It's just you're in this system and something's going to happen now.
Yeah. So I'm curious to see how you kind of wrap all this data together. So how do you manage, and then how do you lead? What is your findings on this? How do we lead cops that are in this turmoil of this environment?
There are sort of two sides to that. One is kind of what we talked about with the procedural and organizational justice, making sure that they feel that there are processes in place. And I have a lot of sort of detail in the brief. It's very common sense, I think. But when I talk to people, I just had them, if this happens, how would you deal with it? And just sort of wrote down what they said and then sort of combined it for the brief. But it's very common sense things. In advance, before one of these things happen, you need to make sure that cops know what they're supposed to do and what consequences they're going to face. Mm-hmm. While something is happening, you need to be as transparent as you can be. Obviously, in some of these cases, there are things that you can't make public or can't tell people, but you need to be open with the police who are not in trouble. Make it clear what's going on with the officer. Make sure to hear out what they're saying. Just make sure to provide them, as you said, a voice. So it's a lot to do with transparency and a lot to do with making sure that fair processes are followed. But there's also, go ahead.
So I was going to ask you about that the transparency part and this one bullet point. What about the idea of releasing the names of the officers? I hear that the citizens want that a lot. And my initial thought is, I don't need you at my house adjudicating this incident before it's been truly adjudicated. I'm just curious your take.
Well, that's somewhere where I'm a little torn between my journalism instincts and my my policing instincts, because just from hearing from police officers, that's people lined up outside your houses. That's something that looms large for cops. But on the other hand, you have a government employee who killed somebody, justified or not. At the same time, I do feel like the public needs to know what happened, and you need to get those names out there, ideally sooner rather than later, because I think the public feels like something is being hidden from them when they don't even know what happened.
Yeah, and if there is a way to mitigate that and say, look, we are going to release these names, but make it a crime, maybe a violation, but you're not allowed to go to their house and do this yet, because technically we have a system of government where everybody's innocent until proven guilty. I tell my officers this too. When you put handcuffs on somebody and you're booking them, understand that in this system of government, you're booking technically an innocent man. You have or woman. You have probable cause to make the arrest, but this hasn't been adjudicated yet. So treat them with dignity and respect and understand in our system. So we should be afforded the same, I guess, graciousness.
I mean it sounds nice. I just don't know how you implement that, because once again we're in a free country. We have a First Amendment. You can stop somebody from trespassing, certainly.
Yeah.
You can arrest somebody for trespassing or making threats or what have you. There are all sorts of laws in the books about that. But if somebody wants to have a protest with your name on the sign, holding it up before you've been convicted, I mean it's just the kind of thing where we're living in a free country, and that's I love that. I think that's a good thing. But that puts a lot of limits on trying to control something.
Yeah, I agree with you too. I don't want to limit it, but then we're looking for the better angels argument, like reserve this for when it happens. Okay, so you got the how to manage turmoil. So then we're going to go with this: encourage healthy, proactive policing activity.
Yeah, and that's my sort of almost tip of the hat to my old instinct of what can you do? Like, because at the end of the day, I think it's true that police are they're public employees. They have superiors who are supposed to be controlling their behavior to some extent and getting them to do what they're supposed to do. And what you're seeing in these situations is they're basically they'll stop doing a part of their jobs, something that they're hired to do. And I think it's still reasonable to say, well, what are you doing about that? You can promise them fair treatment, but at the end of the day, I think it's also fair to say, what are you actually doing to make sure that they're doing this? So I asked, as I was making the rounds and interviewing my cops and my experts, that was something I always made sure to bring up: is what can you do from a more encouragement angle or more of a stick angle? And most people are generally very skeptical of that angle at all. But there are things you can do. There are these proactive. Basically, we measure police activity, right? We have CompStat. We have all these measures of what cops are doing, and superiors keep an eye on those sorts of things, and they use that to manage police. And you can use that to combat this to some extent. You can't have a quota. You can't discipline people, but you can certainly look at who's not working, whose work is dropped off. You can use those data for certain specific things. I know there are several people I interviewed mentioned special units. That if you're a go-getter and you want to get on a special unit, a lot of times your actual activity is going to play a role in that. And if you stop making the arrests and stops that you need to be making on that unit, you'll be thrown off it. Promotions and performance reviews and things like that. And also part of what we talked about before, a lot of people said, it's really important to have sergeants, street level leaders who are interacting with these cops face to face on a regular basis, figuring out what's going on. If you're seeing cops taper off, go talk to them and figure out what's going on. See if you can motivate them, even if you don't have a stick, a threat that you can make to punish them. So I think that angle is part of the issue here, and I think it's something that shouldn't be left out. But I think it just when you go too far with it, you start running into quotas and encouraging cops to make bad stops, or telling them you have to make X number of stops, and they go and harass some college kids to hit their numbers or what have you. And it's a very fraught issue, and it's very difficult to wrap your head around it.
So I've been beating on this drum for a while, and let's start expanding the metrics of good policing, because we have data that will show even when arrests are high, crime can still go up because these officers took this person and they're booking them. So now they're no longer present in their area. And so now that area doesn't have the patrol officer driving around. So there's more crime that could potentially happen. And we have some good data on just being in the area, just having somebody present can thwart crime. So maybe we need to start looking at this. But the hard part is it's hard to measure a non-event. So an officer could say, look, I didn't make any stops. I didn't make any arrests, but in my area, there were no violent robberies. I mean, you can't account for domestic violence or say burglary for motor vehicles. Those are like opportunity type crimes. They're hard to stop unless you're just in the moment. But you can look at these things, or you can make positive contacts and just look, I'm going to park my car here so everybody sees it. There's people up on the front lawn playing. I'm going to walk up and just talk to them. And I'm going to make contact, and then I'm going to log that I talked to 35 people today. And we're going to consider those positive contacts. And that should be a metric of productivity. Can you see that? Can you see a potential for that in future police efficacy?
That's a really interesting idea, and I would like to see it studied a lot more because what you're describing there, that's something that you could implement and then do a study of and see what effect it had. I do know there is some research on just foot patrols,
Hmm.
randomizing where cops walk, and that seems to have an effect. A part of what cops do is that sort of effect that you described, where it's just being present. Nobody wants to commit a crime when there's a cop around, right? I mean, that's not even if you're pretty eager to take risks. That's you might not do it then because there's a cop right there. That's part of what police do is just being present and having that job of interfering, and then that just prevents crime from happening.
Yeah, I've always said this, and I believe I made it up, but maybe I borrowed it. If you judged firefighters by how many fires they put out, like there would be more fires all of a sudden. It's sort of the nature of things. And now I'm not saying they're going to set buildings on fire, but if they said, well, what do you do all day? What do you do for 24 hours? But nobody sort of says that with fire department because they get out there and they stop the fire when it happens. But they're not expected to roll around and prevent fires if they see things or inspect electronic faulty wiring. They don't expect that. Do you see police going to a model like that where we do become sort of a reactionary entity?
Yeah, one of the people I interviewed for the brief, I think he's quoted briefly as Edward Flynn. He's a former Milwaukee police chief, and he pointed out to me that he's retired now, so he's older. He started back before all the CompStat in the '90s and the great crime
Mm,
decline. That in a lot of ways that's how things used to work. I think one of the
mm,
things he told me is that the common saying was something to the effect of nobody ever got in trouble for doing nothing, so that the police would if you call the police, they'll come, but there wasn't a whole lot of pressure on them to do anything but react. Um, and he believed, and I think is very true from the experience of places like New York, and all the other research that we have on proactive policing. That's it's not police can be a lot more effective than that. They can do more than just come
yeah.
on the call. And they can, especially in urban areas where you have a lot of density, where one cop can be in the middle of a lot of people and make sure things are going well for a lot of people. Yeah, I think they can really have an effect in bringing crime down. And I think part of what we're seeing with depolicing is that when they back off and make themselves kind of not seen and not heard so much, that has really bad effects.
So, another idea, and I want to run it by you. So, there is the idea when officers respond to those having a mental health crisis, we want to partner with mental health advocates, registered nurses, social workers, and whatnot. So, you have a civilian and you have an officer, and we deploy them. I'd like to see advocates, activists, whatever it is, somebody who represents the community on a civilian level attached to an officer when they go to these calls so that they can see, man, this cop did everything they could. And like even that suspect or they were irritating me. And even I was telling them, hey man, just go with the program here. This cop's not I saw the radio call just so that you can have another voice so it doesn't seem like it's just us in the silo, the thin blue line and whatnot. Can you see can you see something like that where we have citizens with us so that they also have stake in this?
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of departments do have sort of ride along programs that
Mm-hmm.
citizens can do. I actually remember when I was a little kid, I went with my dad once. When I was in like first or second grade. Um, but um, but I mean, we were talking about the media before too. I mean, I think reaching out to media outlets and offering journalists a ride with a cop for a day or two. I think a lot of people on the crime beat probably already do that here and there. But I mean, just getting out and getting more people to do that through the programs that we already have and setting up more. That I think that could be very good for getting the public to understand more what's going on in all places.
Are you familiar with the work by Jill Leovy? It's a book called Ghetto Side.
Yeah, I wrote a review of that back when it came out. That's 5 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I try to recommend that book to a lot of the officers and even civilians because I hope what people get to see is this isn't like just a police issue. This is sort of a societal issue. And this idea of like a ghetto side as opposed to a homicide. And it would be nice if we could figure out a way to bridge the gap. A lot of the work that I do is with, so I I teach at an academy, and I teach officers, and I try to invite as many citizens as I can and say, look at what we do when we teach implicit bias or procedural justice or any of the number of the topics that are out here now, guardian versus warriors and whatnot. And when citizens see this, I've never had somebody walk out and say, well, this was BS. What a waste of time. They all say, wow, I had no idea that this is the kind of training that you do. Like, more people need to see this, because this is really progressive. This is really forward thinking. These officers are very thoughtful in their responses. It maybe because we do these citizen academies, but there's always this hard line between like citizens and sworn. And maybe we need to, can you see a place where officers get away from that paramilitary, like us and them, and we're the big uniform and whatnot. And we dress in polos, and maybe we have beards, and we're a little bit more like the public and not this authoritarian figure.
I mean, I'm definitely pro beard. I can tell you that. But
Me too.
But yeah, I mean, I think there's always this sort of competing sort of tendencies within policing between, sort of the, quote unquote community policing angle, where you're trying to be part of the community and be responsive to the community, and this idea of police as like a separate force that the rest of society doesn't quite understand what they're going through, and they need to be, the warrior mindset and that whole
yeah.
Um,
Did any of your in any of your research, did anything come up about a strict adherence to tradition that stifles innovation or stifles creativity?
I mean, that's certainly something that I've noticed just from following this. I'm not sure that any of my interviewees brought it up, but yeah, I mean, I think there are sort of rules that catch on in policing and ways of doing things that get passed down, and there's a lot of resistance to it sometimes, especially from, as you mentioned, older officers not wanting to wear body cameras and that sort of thing. And I think that's a very human tendency that you get used to doing things a certain way and resist changing it.
Yeah, it seems like there's a split personality, because in some ways I see organizations, the big five organizations, Chicago, New York, Philly, Houston, and Los Angeles, and they want to be the leader in police training, and they want to do all the cool things and implement the new training and have the bolo wraps and the body worn cameras and all the great stuff. But then there is this like strict adherence to these traditional norms that I think, well, we have a policy for everything, for how you act and how you're supposed to act and the kind of language you can use. And we use things like, you're going to be very professional. And how do we define professional? We're going to call everybody sir and ma'am. Like that's and nowadays that's not, we shouldn't be making those assumptions. And I've been told more than once, when I call somebody ma'am, they look around, they're like, why would you call me ma'am? Like they're insulted as opposed to miss or whatnot. And how would you start to, if somebody were to ask you for advice, hypothetically, how do you start breaking down those traditions so that we can have some innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think police are, as I think as that illustrates to an extent, they are very rule driven. So I mean, if you have a new agency policy and you say this is the policy and this is why we're doing it, and explain to them that you're going to try something different. I mean, I think a number of cops are going to be responsive to that. But yeah, it's an interesting question, because you have all these different agencies throughout the country who all do things in different ways. So, should
there be a federal standard in policing? I asked Professor Moskos this, and I'm curious what you think in your research. Should there be this idea?
I mean, I'm a big federalist. I mean, I believe that the federal government has its constitutional role, and the states have their own constitutional role, and federalizing something like that would be very, very problematic. But that said, can the federal government develop a standard that agencies are free to adopt? That sort of thing can be very helpful, I think, because you have I think it's 18,000 some agencies across the country. A lot of them are very small. I think a lot of the smaller departments are looking for ways to adopt things that have been developed elsewhere that are proven to work, because they don't have the capacity to develop all their own rules and procedures. So if you have bigger departments or the federal government developing some sort of model policies that they can use, I think that's fine. That's
fair. have you done, and I don't want to, if this is a topic you don't want to get into, just let me know. Have you done any work on or been interested in sort of the press's coverage of officers and vaccines, firefighters and vaccines? Is that something you've delved into?
I'm a consumer of that reporting because it's been everywhere.
Okay.
It's very, very interesting. I mean, I think on one hand, police are interacting with the public a lot. They're doing a lot interacting with the public, and COVID-19 is obviously it's a serious thing.
Yeah.
And I think telling police officers that they should get vaccinated is probably a reasonable request. But the thing is, whenever you do something like that, you have that trade off. Are we going to how many cops are we going to lose, and how much damage are we going to do to morale forcing this on people who don't want it? And that's the trade off.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly doesn't help the cause right now with morale where it is.
No.
And certain people just want to be defiant at this point. They're just so upset. It's just, I don't even care. I just want to be defiant.
Yeah, I feel like it doesn't help the morale issue, and it also doesn't help the public's perception a lot of the time because it's you have police a lot of negative attitudes toward police now, and when you have everywhere you turn, there's a news story about cops refusing to get vaccinated and needing to be forced and resisting it, and the unions are resisting it. I don't think that does any good for that cause either.
Okay, so your thoughts on this. So your final best advice for, say, like the street level sergeant that's trying to keep their troops motivated and trying to show them the big picture and the "this too shall pass" sort of rah-rah speech. What would you say to that group of people?
Well, rah-rah speeches are not my specialty at all. But I mean, I think the big point is that after these incidents, there are just such an incredible increase in crime and so much suffering that gets caused by policing. That for example, I mentioned the Debbie Fryer study. I think they found 900 excess homicides caused by just this handful of incidents in these cities. So what I would impress on people is that our job here is to protect people. Our job is to prevent crimes. And this is a time where a lot of cities experience this huge increase in crime, and we're in a position to do something about it. And it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be, people don't hold us in the highest esteem right now, but our job right now is to do that. So I think that's the big point to hit, is that just that you have an opportunity to really save lives at a time like this, and please get into this line of work, I think, for that reason.
Yeah.
So peeling back the idea that they made that oath, and that's why they're police officers.
Exactly, Robert. I agree, and I like how you said it. You said it very eloquently, and if I piggyback on it, we didn't enter this profession because we said, oh, this is going to be easy, and you shouldn't be just given LA's finest, New York's finest, Chicago's finest. That comes with the burden of having to sacrifice sometimes. Mm-hmm. And these times are rough, but we do it because we need to do it. So I appreciate the sort of, what is it, the tough love that you're putting out there, because clearly you're data driven and you're trying to be fair and you're trying to be reasonable, but at the same time there is accountability to this. You don't get to just stomp your feet and grab your basketball and walk off the court. Like, you took an oath, and we got to do it, and we got to step forward, and we got to keep going, because, like you say eloquently, lives are at stake.
Yeah.
Is there anything, I don't want to take too much of your time. You're giving me great info, and I like your work. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about, or you want to talk about maybe some upcoming work that you have going?
Oh, I mean, I've got some other work in the pipeline, but nothing that's in a position to be not talking about publicly yet, unfortunately. But yeah, I think we covered all the main points of my brief. We walked through, I think, the whole thing.
And how can people find you? Twitter and your webpage?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at it's R.A. Verbruggen. That's VERBRUGGEN. That's probably the best way to get in touch with me. Otherwise, there's through the Manhattan Institute. There's a
Excellent, sir. Well, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming on, and with that, I look forward to reading more of your work and maybe having you back on again if you would.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, sir. Have a good night.
You too.